In the sleepy town of Ardenwood, autumn was always welcomed with a chilly embrace, wrapping the narrow streets and quaint houses in a mist that lingered well into the morning. As Halloween approached, the locals would decorate their porches with carved pumpkins and cobwebs, unwittingly setting the stage for something far more sinister than trick-or-treaters. This year, the Carpenter family, recent transplants from the bustling city of New York, moved into the old Henderson place at the edge of town, a reputedly haunted mansion that had stood vacant for over a decade. Despite the locals' whispered warnings, the Carpenters were skeptics, dismissing ghost stories as mere superstitions. Their family consisted of Jack, a stern and practical man, his wife Sarah, who possessed a curious nature, and their two children, Emily, a bright-eyed 12-year-old with a penchant for adventure, and little Mikey, who at 8 was both fearless and impressionable. Their first night in the mansion, Emily claimed she heard whispers emanating from the attic, a soft, unintelligible murmur that seemed to beckon her. Jack assured her it was just the wind, but Sarah's interest was piqued. She decided to explore the attic the next day, finding only dust-covered boxes and old furniture draped in white sheets, which cast eerie shadows in the dim light that filtered through the small window. As October deepened, so did the strangeness surrounding the Carpenters' new home. Objects began to move inexplicably. An old portrait of Mr. Henderson, the original owner, would often be found facing the wall, and cold spots would appear and vanish without any discernible cause. The town's historian, Mr. Whitmore, a gaunt man with a keen interest in the paranormal, warned them that the Henderson estate was cursed. He spoke of a grim history, a tale of forbidden rituals and a family turning upon itself, spiraling into madness and death. One rainy evening, as thunder rolled over Ardenwood, Emily and Mikey were playing in the living room while Jack worked in his makeshift office and Sarah prepared dinner. A sudden power outage plunged the house into darkness. As they scrambled for candles, Mikey's voice, quivering with fear, called out from the living room. "Mommy, the man in the picture wants to talk." Heart-pounding, Sarah rushed to her children, finding Emily clutching Mikey, who stared wide-eyed at the portrait of Mr. Henderson, which now rested perfectly on the mantel. Sarah could almost swear she saw a smirk flicker across the painted lips before the house groaned, as if buckling under a heavy weight. That night, unable to sleep, Sarah confided in Jack her fears that perhaps the town's legends were rooted in truth. Jack, ever the skeptic, agreed to humor his wife by inviting Mr. Whitmore to conduct a séance, hoping to put her fears to rest. The séance took place on a stormy night, the air charged with electricity. Mr. Whitmore, Sarah, Jack, and a reluctant Emily gathered around a large, old table in the dining room, hands lightly touching the edges. Their historian began to chant in a low, steady tone, calling forth the spirits of the house. The candles flickered as the temperature dropped, breaths visible in the cold air. Then a voice, old and crackling like dry leaves, spoke from the darkness. "Leave this place," it warned, the words echoing through the room, chilling the very marrow in their bones. But before they could break from the séance, a loud crash sounded from upstairs, the attic. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The voice continued, "Find the truth under the floor." The session ended abruptly, leaving everyone shaken. Jack, driven now by a protective instinct, decided they would investigate the attic again come morning. As they prepared to head upstairs, they were stopped short by the sound of footsteps, quick, heavy thuds, descending the attic stairs. As the door creaked open, revealing nothing but the empty hallway, the Carpenters realized that whatever haunted their home was not bound by physical constraints. The secrets of the Henderson estate beckoned, promising answers that were as terrifying as the mysteries themselves. The next morning, armed with tools, they would pry open the floor of the attic, unaware that what lay beneath might alter their lives forever. They stood at the threshold, the first light of dawn casting long shadows, as they steeled themselves to uncover the darkness hidden within the heart of their home. As the first rays of the sun pierced through the dense fog of the early morning, the Carpenter family stood at the foot of the attic stairs, each battling their own swell of dread. Jack clutched a crowbar, his usual skepticism eroded by the chilling events of the night before. Sarah, her curiosity now laced with fear, held a flashlight that trembled slightly in her grip. Emily and Mikey, usually irrepressible in their energy, clung to each other, their youthful bravado overshadowed by the palpable tension. The attic door creaked ominously as they pushed it open, the stale air greeting them with whispers of the past. The room was dim, lit only by the weak sunlight that poured through the dirty window. Dust particles danced in the beams of light, creating a spectral ballet. They moved cautiously, the floorboards groaning under their weight, as if protesting their intrusion. "Mom, do we really have to do this?" Emily's voice was a mere whisper, barely audible over the thumping of their hearts. Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand reassuringly, though her own confidence faltered. "We need to understand what's happening, honey. It might help us make things right." Jack began prying up the wooden planks near the far corner of the attic, where the disturbances seemed most concentrated during the seance. The sound of the crowbar against the old wood was jarring in the quiet room. After several tense minutes, a plank came loose, revealing a dark cavity beneath. The flashlight's beam pierced the darkness, illuminating a small, hidden space that exuded a cold air, chilling their bones. Inside, amidst a layer of dust and cobwebs, lay a small, leather-bound book. Its cover was worn, and the pages yellowed with age. Jack reached in and retrieved it, his hands cautious as if the tome might disintegrate at his touch. "What is that?" Mikey asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and fear. "It looks like a diary," Sarah answered, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and intrigue. She carefully opened the cover, the musty smell of old paper filling the air. The diary belonged to Elizabeth Henderson, the wife of the original owner. Her entries started innocuously, with day-to-day accounts of life in Ardenwood. But as they turned the pages, the tone shifted dramatically. Elizabeth began to speak of strange visions, voices in the night that no one else could hear, and her growing fear of something she referred to only as the presence. "It doesn't want us here," one entry read. "It whispers at night, talks of blood and retribution. Thomas doesn't hear it, thinks me mad. But I see its shadows, dancing in the corners. It's real as the heart that beats in my chest." As Sarah read aloud, the air in the attic grew colder, and the light from the flashlight flickered. An uneasy feeling settled over them, as if unseen eyes watched their every move. "Mom, I don't like this," Emily murmured, hugging her brother closer. Jack, normally the voice of reason, felt the stirrings of ancient fears, unbidden and unwelcome. "Maybe we should stop." "No," Sarah interrupted, her voice firmer than they'd expected. "We need to know. For our family. If there's something here, something that means to do us harm, we need to face it." She continued to read, the entries growing more disjointed and frantic. Elizabeth wrote of rituals performed in the dead of night, of her husband's descent into obsession with the occult, driven by a desperate need to contact the beyond. The last entry was the most disturbing. "Tonight, it ends, one way or another. Thomas has gone too far. I fear for our souls, for this house. If you are reading this, know I tried to stop it. Forgive us our trespasses." A sudden, sharp noise snapped them out of the trance the diary had cast. A thud from below, as if something heavy had fallen or been dropped. They exchanged wide-eyed looks, the same unspoken question passing among them. "What now? Should we go down?" Jack asked, his voice betraying his anxiety. Before anyone could answer, a low moan echoed through the house, a sound so filled with sorrow and pain it chilled them to the core. It was followed by a whisper, a hiss that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Leave her now." Yet, they remained frozen, caught between the terror of the unknown and the need to protect their home and family. As they stood there, the temperature dropping and the light dimming, they realized the house was beginning to settle into a new phase of its long, haunted history. As the first rays of the sun pierced through the dense fog of the early morning, the Carpenter family stood at the foot of the attic stairs, each battling their own swell of dread. Jack clutched a crowbar, his usual skepticism eroded by the chilling events of the night before. Sarah, her curiosity now laced with fear, held a flashlight that trembled slightly in her grip. Emily and Mikey, usually irrepressible in their energy, clung to each other, their youthful bravado overshadowed by the palpable tension. The attic door creaked ominously as they pushed it open, the stale air greeting them with whispers of the past. The room was dim, lit only by the weak sunlight that poured through the dirty window. Dust particles danced in the beams of light, creating a spectral ballet. They moved cautiously, the floorboards groaning under their weight, as if protesting their intrusion. "Mom, do we really have to do this?" Emily's voice was a mere whisper, barely audible over the thumping of their hearts. Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand reassuringly, though her own confidence faltered. "We need to understand what's happening, honey. It might help us make things right." Jack began prying up the wooden planks near the far corner of the attic, where the disturbances seemed most concentrated during the seance. The sound of the crowbar against the old wood was jarring in the quiet room. After several tense minutes, a plank came loose, revealing a dark cavity beneath. The flashlight's beam pierced the darkness, illuminating a small, hidden space that exuded a cold air, chilling their bones. Inside, amidst a layer of dust and cobwebs, lay a small, leather-bound book. Its cover was worn, and the pages yellowed with age. Jack reached in and retrieved it, his hands cautious as if the tome might disintegrate at his touch. "What is that?" Mikey asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and fear. "It looks like a diary," Sarah answered, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and intrigue. She carefully opened the cover, the musty smell of old paper filling the air. The diary belonged to Elizabeth Henderson, the wife of the original owner. Her entries started innocuously, with day-to-day accounts of life in Ardenwood. But as they turned the pages, the tone shifted dramatically. Elizabeth began to speak of strange visions, voices in the night that no one else could hear, and her growing fear of something she referred to only as the presence. "It doesn't want us here," one entry read. "It whispers at night, talks of blood and retribution. Thomas doesn't hear it, thinks me mad. But I see its shadows, dancing in the corners. It's real as the heart that beats in my chest." As Sarah read aloud, the air in the attic grew colder, and the light from the flashlight flickered. An uneasy feeling settled over them, as if unseen eyes watched their every move. "Mom, I don't like this," Emily murmured, hugging her brother closer. Jack, normally the voice of reason, felt the stirrings of ancient fears, unbidden and unwelcome. "Maybe we should stop." "No," Sarah interrupted, her voice firmer than they'd expected. "We need to know. For our family. If there's something here, something that means to do us harm, we need to face it." She continued to read, the entries growing more disjointed and frantic. Elizabeth wrote of rituals performed in the dead of night, of her husband's descent into obsession with the occult, driven by a desperate need to contact the beyond. The last entry was the most disturbing. "Tonight, it ends, one way or another. Thomas has gone too far. I fear for our souls, for this house. If you are reading this, know I tried to stop it. Forgive us our trespasses." A sudden, sharp noise snapped them out of the trance the diary had cast. A thud from below, as if something heavy had fallen or been dropped. They exchanged wide-eyed looks, the same unspoken question passing among them. "What now? Should we go down?" Jack asked, his voice betraying his anxiety. Before anyone could answer, a low moan echoed through the house, a sound so filled with sorrow and pain it chilled them to the core. It was followed by a whisper, a hiss that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Leave now." Yet, they remained frozen, caught between the terror of the unknown and the need to protect their home and family. As they stood there, the temperature dropping and the light dimming, they realized the house was beginning to settle into a new phase of its long, haunted history. The ghostly whisper that had threaded through the Carpenter family's ears seemed to hang in the air, reverberating with an icy foreboding that refused to dissipate. As the whisper faded into a suffocating silence, the family exchanged fearful glances, each battling a torrent of unease that threatened to overwhelm their resolve. Jack was the first to break the silence. "We should check downstairs. If there's something else we need to find, it might be there." His voice, though firm, could not mask the tremor that hinted at his underlying fear. Armed with the flashlight whose beam now seemed too dim and the crowbar as a makeshift weapon, the family descended the attic stairs. The house creaked under their weight, a chorus of moans and groans that sounded almost like lamentations from the walls themselves. As they reached the ground floor, the air grew inexplicably colder, their breath visible in the ghostly light. The hallway stretched before them, shrouded in shadows that seemed to shift and whisper with a life of their own. Mikey clung to Emily, who, despite her own fear, tried to offer her brother a reassuring smile. "Stay close," Sarah whispered, leading the way with the flashlight. They moved toward the living room, where the crash had originated. The living room was a tableau of twilight shadows, the furniture silhouetted like specters in the dim light. The portrait of Mr. Henderson had fallen face down on the floor, its frame cracked, as if forcibly struck down. Approaching it, Jack hesitated before turning it over. The face on the portrait was no longer the stern, benign expression they remembered but seemed twisted, almost pained, the eyes now gazing upward in what looked like eternal terror. "It changed," Emily gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't like that before." As they stood contemplating the portrait, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, the storm outside mirroring the chaos inside. Thunder rumbled, a deep, menacing growl that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth. Determined to uncover more, they continued their search, their footsteps echoing in the unnaturally silent house. In the dining room, the table where they had held the seance was untouched, but the air around it was charged, the hairs on their arms standing on end as if electric currents flowed invisibly around them. Sarah, drawn to the fireplace, noticed something peculiar, a slight draft that seemed to emanate from beneath the hearthstone. "Jack, come here," she called softly, kneeling down and feeling the cold air with her hand. Together, they discovered that one of the stones was loose. With effort, they managed to shift it, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside, wrapped in a black oilcloth, was another book, much older and bound in faded leather with strange symbols etched into the cover. Jack carefully opened the book, his hands trembling. The pages were filled with arcane symbols and diagrams, interspersed with writings in a language they couldn't recognize. "What is this?" he murmured, a sense of dread settling over him. "It looks like some kind of grimoire," Sarah whispered, her knowledge of occult matters gleaned from books and whispered legends suddenly taking on a horrifying relevance. As they examined the grimoire, a piercing scream shattered the silence, echoing through the house. It was Mikey. Dropping the book, they rushed to the foyer, where they had left the children sitting on the stairs. Mikey was pale, his eyes wide with terror, pointing toward the ceiling. "Upstairs, something's there." "I saw it." "What did you see, Mikey?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "A shadow," Mikey stammered. "It was looking at me from the top of the stairs, then it moved away." They all turned toward the staircase, the upper part shrouded in darkness. The idea of returning upstairs was daunting, yet the need to protect their home, to understand what plagued it, drove them to confront whatever awaited. Gathering their courage, they ascended the stairs, the old wood creaking ominously under their feet. At the top, the hallway was bathed in an otherworldly glow, the moonlight casting eerie patterns through the window at the far end. The doors along the hallway were all closed, except for the one leading to Emily and Mikey's room, which was ajar, swinging slightly as if touched by an unseen hand. Approaching it, Sarah pushed the door fully open, the room beyond bathed in silvery moonlight. And there, in the middle of the room, stood a shadowy figure, tall and thin, its outline blurred and shifting. Its presence was suffocating, the air around it thick with despair and malevolence. It turned toward them slowly, an inky darkness that seemed to suck the light from the room. No features were discernible, yet they could feel it watching them, its gaze piercing their very souls. Jack instinctively stepped in front of his family, the crowbar raised in a defensive gesture, his body tensed for a confrontation. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice echoing slightly in the moonlit room. The shadow didn't speak, but its presence intensified, a palpable pressure that seemed to weigh on their chests, making it difficult to breathe. Sarah clutched at her chest, her breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. "It's oppressive. I can barely breathe," she whispered, her voice strained with panic. Emily, holding Mikey's hand tightly, whispered to him, trying to shield her brother from the horror of the sight. "Close your eyes, Mikey. Don't look at it." But Mikey, his curiosity overcoming his fear, peeked through his fingers. "Why is it here?" he whimpered. The room grew colder still, the temperature dropping so suddenly that their breaths became visible, puffing out in frantic, white clouds. The shadow moved closer, its form undulating slightly, as if composed of a swirling, dark mist. With each movement, a low, mournful wail filled the room, the sound heart-wrenching and chilling. Suddenly, the light from the hallway flickered, and a loud bang sounded from downstairs, as if something heavy had been dropped or knocked over. Jack flinched, momentarily distracted, and when he turned back, the figure was gone, as if it had never been there. "Where did it go?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling, scanning the room frantically. "I don't know, but we can't stay here," Jack replied, his decision firm despite his fear. "We need to leave, now." They hurried back to the staircase, descending in haste, afraid the shadow might reappear at any moment. Reaching the ground floor, they were met with another scene of disarray. Books had been thrown from the shelves in the study, papers were scattered all over the floor, and a picture frame lay smashed on the ground. Their house seemed to groan under a strain, the walls themselves shivering with an unspoken dread. Their family gathered in the living room, the reality of their situation sinking in. They were dealing with something beyond their understanding, something ancient and malevolent. "We can't just leave," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the shaking of her hands. "This is our home. We have to find out what it wants and how to stop it." "But how?" Emily asked, her voice small. "We don't know what we're dealing with." "We start with the books," Sarah responded, her resolve hardening. "The diary, the grimoire. There has to be a connection. We need to understand the history of this house, of the Hendersons." They returned to the study, carefully stepping over the strewn papers. Jack retrieved the grimoire from where they had dropped it in the foyer. Opening it once more, he tried to make sense of the strange symbols and writings, but it was like nothing he had ever seen. "We might need help," he suggested. "Someone who understands these things better than we do." As they pondered their next move, the air around them shifted once again, the earlier oppressive atmosphere replaced by a sudden urgency, as if the house itself was reacting to their decision to fight back. The lights flickered, then stabilized, and the house fell silent, a tense, expectant silence, like the calm before a storm. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the house, the trees bending under its force. It seemed as if nature itself was aligning with the dark presence within the mansion, setting the stage for the inevitable confrontation that lay ahead. In the deep shadows of the house, unseen eyes watched them, waiting, plotting. The battle for the Carpenter family's home, and their souls, was just beginning. In the dimly lit study surrounded by disarray, the Carpenter family huddled together, a semblance of safety in their unity against the unseen threats. The air was thick, each breath a labor, as if the house itself resisted their intake of oxygen. The storm outside raged, a tumultuous symphony that mirrored the chaos within the walls of the old Henderson estate. Jack, his hand still holding the mysterious grimoire, scanned the pages with a frown deepening on his brow. "There has to be something here," he muttered, his words more to steel his own courage than to reassure his family. The script was indecipherable, symbols and ancient texts twisted in ways that seemed to dance away just as he thought he might understand their form. Sarah, her maternal instincts fortified by fear for her children's safety, paced by the window, peering out into the storm. The trees swayed violently, their branches scratching against the glass like the fingers of a desperate spectre. "We need help," she echoed Jack's earlier suggestion, her voice barely above the howl of the wind. "Someone who knows about these things." Emily held Mikey close, her eyes wide as she watched her parents. The atmosphere of fear was palpable, feeding into the children's anxiety. Mikey's voice was small, almost lost in the surrounding din. "Is the shadow going to come back?" Before anyone could answer, a sharp knock sounded at the front door, startling everyone. In a house fraught with inexplicable occurrences, the simple act of a visitor knocking felt ominously out of place. Jack moved cautiously toward the door, crowbar still in hand. Peering through the peephole, his body tensed visibly. "It's Mr. Whitmore," he announced, a trace of disbelief in his voice. Opening the door revealed the town historian, his coat drenched, his face gaunt and pale under the brim of his soaked hat. "I felt it," he said without preamble, stepping into the foyer. "The energy, the storm, it's all connected. You've stirred something ancient." Sarah led him into the living room, urging, "Tell us what you know. Please." Whitmore removed his hat, running a hand through his damp hair. "This house, the land it's built on, it's old, far older than any of us realized. The Hendersons, they weren't the first here, there were others." He pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat, old maps and documents. "Look here," he pointed to a map dated back to the 1700s, "this land was marked as sacred, possibly cursed. The indigenous people avoided it, and early settlers reported disturbances." Jack spread the map on the coffee table, the family leaning in. "And the rituals, the diary mentioned?" he asked. Whitmore nodded solemnly. "Thomas Henderson dabbled in the occult, yes, but he was not the originator. These lands have seen rituals performed for centuries, perhaps to appease something below, or to contain it." The wind seemed to scream in response, rattling the windows with renewed vigor. The historian continued, "Your being here, opening the house, it may have restarted a cycle that was meant to end, or never meant to be disturbed. So, what do we do?" Sarah's voice was desperate, searching for any sliver of hope or direction. "We need to understand exactly what was done here, what Thomas Henderson's rituals were meant to achieve, or prevent." Whitmore glanced at the grimoire Jack held. "That book may have answers, but it's in a language lost to time. We'll need a specialist." As they discussed their next steps, an eerie calm settled over the house. The storm outside lessened, the wind dying down as suddenly as it had risen, leaving a silence that was almost more terrifying in its completeness. The family agreed to Whitmore's plan to contact a colleague of his, an expert in ancient languages and occult practices. As Whitmore made the call, the rest of the family tried to fortify themselves, gathering candles and other necessities in case the power went out again. Mikey, ever observant, tugged at Emily's sleeve. "Look," he whispered, pointing towards the staircase. At the top, barely visible in the dim light, the shadow appeared again. It was still, just watching. The moment held, everyone frozen as the shadow loomed. Then, without warning, it receded, disappearing into the darkness of the upper floor as if it had never been there. Whitmore hung up the phone, his expression grim. "Help is on the way," he announced. "But we must be cautious. We've only just begun to realize what we're facing, and tonight has shown it's aware of us now. The Carpenter family settled into an uneasy vigil, waiting for the expert who might help them unravel the mystery of their as the Carpenter family and Mr. Whitmore gathered in the dimly lit living room. Each person was acutely aware of the oppressive silence that now blanketed the house. The storm outside had dwindled to a light drizzle, the occasional drip of water from the eaves tapping rhythmically against the windows, a stark contrast to the earlier cacophony. The air within the house felt charged, heavy with anticipation, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The tension was palpable, the wait for Whitmore's colleague stretching into what seemed like an eternity. Each minute that ticked by was a minute too long, and with each passing moment, the shadow's fleeting presence at the top of the stairs seemed to grow in significance, a dark harbinger of what might come. Finally, the sound of a car engine broke the silence, and headlights swept through the living room window as a vehicle pulled into the driveway. Mr. Whitmore stood abruptly, his movements sharp with urgency. "That will be Dr. Elspeth Rendell," he announced, moving toward the door. "She's an expert in ancient languages and esoteric rituals." The door opened to reveal a woman in her late 50s, her grey hair pulled back into a tight bun, her eyes sharp and assessing behind thin-rimmed glasses. She stepped into the house, a briefcase in hand, and without any preamble, she asked, "Where is the book?" Jack handed her the grimoire, his hand slightly shaking. Dr. Rendell opened the book with care, her eyes quickly scanning the pages. "Fascinating," she murmured under her breath. "This is written in a dialect of Aramaic, mixed with symbols that are not just decorative but functional. They're protective seals." The group gathered around her, the children's eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Can you break the seals?" Sarah asked, her voice tense. Dr. Rendell looked up from the book, her expression serious. "Breaking the seals might not be the best term. It's more about understanding and possibly appeasing the forces at work. This book," she tapped the leather cover of the grimoire, "is essentially a manual for containing something very powerful and very old." She suggested they move to the dining room table where she could spread out her materials and work more effectively. As they set up a makeshift workspace, Dr. Rendell explained her plan. "We need to conduct a controlled ritual, using the exact reverse of what was performed by Thomas Henderson. If he invoked something, we need to revoke it, respectfully and carefully." Jack and Sarah exchanged a look of trepidation. "What risks are we looking at?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite his concern. "The risk is significant," Dr. Rendell admitted. "We could potentially anger whatever entity has been disturbed. Or we could free it instead of containing it again. However, doing nothing is arguably more dangerous. The activity has escalated since you arrived, correct?" They nodded, and she continued, "That suggests it's aware of your presence and likely not willing to revert to dormancy on its own." The setup was meticulous. Dr. Rendell arranged several ancient symbols around the room, placing candles at strategic points. She instructed everyone on where to stand and made clear that once the ritual started, no one was to move or speak unless instructed. As night deepened around them and the house seemed to settle into an eerie stillness, Dr. Rendell began the ritual. She chanted in a flowing, rhythmic cadence, her voice weaving through the flickering candlelight. The symbols around the room glowed faintly, an ethereal light that pulsed gently. The air in the room thickened, a tangible pressure that made it hard to breathe. The candles flickered violently as if caught in an unseen storm. The shadows in the corners of the room grew deeper, stretching towards the center of the room where the family and Dr. Rendell stood encircled by the protective seals. Then, abruptly, the temperature dropped, a cold so intense it seared their lungs. A low growl echoed through the house, a sound primal and full of malice. The shadows converged towards the center of the circle, coalescing into a dark figure, larger and more defined than any shadow they had seen before. It was a moment of truth, a confrontation with the unknown that they had been both dreading and anticipating. The family stood frozen, clutching each other's hands, their fate hanging in the balance as Dr. Rendell continued her incantations, her voice now a commanding shout over the crescendo of growling and wind. The climax of the confrontation was nearing, the outcome uncertain, each chant, each candle flicker playing a part in the final battle for the soul of the Henderson estate and the safety of the Carpenter family. As Dr. Rendell's voice reached a crescendo, the room seemed to pulse with energy, the air vibrating as if alive with unseen forces. The dark figure at the center of the shadows grew more distinct, its form swirling with a malevolent grace, tendrils of darkness reaching out as if to break the protective barrier formed by the ancient symbols. Sarah clutched Emily and Mikey close, her eyes wide with fear but fixed on the figure, ready to shield her children at any cost. Jack stood beside them, his body tensed for action, though he knew there was little he could do against such an ethereal adversary. Dr. Rendell, undeterred by the growing darkness, continued her ritual. The ancient Aramaic words seemed to hang in the air, glowing embers in the thickening gloom. "Hear me, O forces bound by earth and time," she intoned, her voice now booming, resonant with power. "By the circle of elders, I command thee to retreat." The shadow figure paused, as if considering the challenge, its form pulsing as though breathing. Then, with a scream that seemed to come from the very walls of the house, it surged forward, testing the barrier. The candles flared as if in defiance, the symbols glowing brighter, a golden light that held the darkness at bay. Suddenly, the center of the room where the figure loomed exploded with a blinding light. Everyone shielded their eyes, the children whimpering in fear. The light was pure and fierce, sweeping through the room like a tidal wave of energy. When it receded, the shadow was gone, leaving behind only the faintest echo of its presence, like a bad dream fading at dawn. The room was silent, the threat apparently vanquished. Dr. Rendell ceased chanting, her posture relaxing as she surveyed the room, her eyes lingering on the spots where the candles had burned brightest. "It's done," she said finally, a note of exhaustion in her voice. "The entity has been repelled, its hold on this place broken." The family, still huddled together, slowly began to relax, the tension draining from their bodies. Sarah looked around, her eyes meeting Jack's. "Is it really over?" she whispered. "For now," Dr. Rendell replied, packing away her materials. "These rituals, they are not permanent solutions but a means to restore balance temporarily. It may attempt to return, or it may seek out a new place to rest. Be vigilant, but for now, you have reclaimed your home." The next few days were quiet, the house seemingly at peace. The air felt lighter, cleaner somehow, as if it too had been cleansed by the ritual. The Carpenters began to settle into their new life, the children's laughter once again filling the rooms, the memory of dark shadows slowly fading but not entirely forgotten. Jack and Sarah decided to keep the grimoire and Elizabeth Henderson's diary locked away, a reminder of what they had faced and overcome. They occasionally met with Dr. Rendell and Mr. Whitmore, who continued to research the history of the land and the dark forces that had once claimed it. Life returned to normal, but the experience had changed them. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, when the wind howled just right, Sarah would pause, a chill running down her spine as she wondered if the darkness was truly gone. She would glance at the old portrait of Mr. Henderson, now rehung in the hallway, his eyes no longer twisted in terror but somber, watchful. And in those moments, she knew that while they might have won the battle, the war against the unseen might never be fully over. They had learned to live with the unknown, respecting the delicate balance between light and dark. The house stood firm, a sentinel against the night, its walls imbued with the strength of their conviction, a beacon of light in a world that held shadows at bay, always waiting, ever watchful. The Carpenters had found their home, not just in a place, but in their unyielding spirit, forever bound to the legacy of the Henderson estate.